All right, so welcome back, everybody. It's the monthly AVH webinars. This month, it is my pleasure, honor, and anticipated desire to reintroduce Dr. Joel Shepard, who's going to be talking about the Hahnemannian conception of the miasms. I think Joel, correct me if I'm wrong, and basically what a miasm really is in Dr. Hahnemann's mind, or what it was in his mind. So, Joel, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Jeff. I look at the homeopaths and the literature and the videos that they make, and every homeopath seems to have their own interpretation of miasms. I tried to read Hahnemann's description of miasms without injecting my own theories and my own beliefs, my own knowledge of modern science into his language, so that this will be a presentation of what I expect Hahnemann intended for the word miasm, and try to bridge the old language with modern science and modern language and show what Hahnemann actually meant by miasms. We're going to start with a human disease, human miasm, and talk about one example in humans first, but after a while then we'll try to generalize how miasms can apply to animals as well. So it's a PowerPoint presentation. I just wanted to make a brief introduction, and now I'm going to turn on the PowerPoint. That won't be a problem as that clicked. It'll just go on top of the webinar screen. So the example that we're going to use of Hahnemann's language and miasms is the syphilis miasm.
Okay, excuse me, are you showing your screen yet, Joel? Because we don't have the PowerPoint up yet.
Right, I'm going to put the PowerPoint up now. So
all right.
Here goes. All right, and is it visible as a...
Not yet. Why don't you try turning your webcam off?
I'll do that.
And let's see because right now we still see your webinar screen.
All right.
Did you click on show my screen when I made you presenter? Should I? There it is. Perfect.
Now you see the slides?
Perfect. Yep.
All right. So then, let's see if I can start the slideshow the way I want it. If I'm going to cut off the webinar control panel, is that all right?
Yep, you're perfect. I'll let you know what's going on.
Okay. So let's see if we can start it. All right, here goes. Is that working?
Yep.
So this first slide says syphilis and homeopathy. The Hahnemann used syphilis as one of the first three miasms that he described, but syphilis is also the name of a disease in modern times in medicine. So we have a confusion of language right from the beginning. So let's talk about human syphilis first, but in context. That is, Hahnemann said chronic disease can develop by three different pathways. One pathway is bad lifestyle. That is, chronic disease can be a result of wrong diet, wrong life habits, wrong exercise, wrong amount of sleep, wrong amount of rest. All those things that the naturopaths call health determinants can lead to chronic disease, but they are correctable if you change your lifestyle and your life decisions. Second pathway for chronic disease, said Hahnemann, was from wrong treatment. and wrong treatment to homeopath means anything allopathically, so that the allopathic side effects or adverse reactions create a disease in a person that becomes chronic as long as you're on those medications. The third pathway was the one that Hahnemann developed later after lots of experience and lots of time in practice, and which he called the true natural chronic diseases caused by chronic miasms. So the word miasm was a rather common word in Hahnemann's time and is not very useful in modern times. So first, a definition of miasms. That is, I went to a medical dictionary published in 1805 in English to find out what miasms meant at the time of Hahnemann. And it says that miasms are an aerial fluid surrounding a sick person, and that fluid, which carried a contagion, depended on the type of the disease the person had and how seriously they were ill. It would radiate, that sickening fluid would radiate a certain distance depending on those factors. So one group of scientists, doctors, thought that the miasma was a chemical that diffused in the air. Hahnemann did not believe that, because then he thought that the chronic disease could be caught by people at an indefinite distance, right? The chemical could go on diffusing through the air for long distances. Instead, he thought it was caused by invisible, minute little animals that were in the air. So he anticipated the germ theory long before Pasteur and Koch, at least 50 years, even though he did not see them or demonstrate that they were there. So miasm then was Hahnemann's subdivision in disease that implied that there was a contagion, an infectious agent, or as his words in the Organon, it's a dynamic contagion. So miasms come about in people, cause disease, or a pathway disease due to dynamic contagion. So we have to explore that word a little later, the word dynamic and the word contagion in modern times. So back to syphilis. So syphilis then is considered a disease caused by an infectious agent, a bacteria, and some mainstream biologists, namely Lynn Margulies' group, had nothing to do with homeopathy. She's passed away, but her group has done research on bacteria extensively, and especially on syphilis recently, and they see that antibiotics don't truly cure or kill all the syphilis bacteria. The syphilis bacteria have the ability to get into a cystic form, a form that's resistant to the bacteria, and sequester themselves in areas that the antibiotics can't reach, and then come alive or become more infectious when the conditions are right later on. So this is all work done by people outside homeopathy. They think that the tests that are screening for syphilis are also inaccurate and underreporting how much syphilis there actually is, because it only works in the very early stages to find the syphilis. After secondary and tertiary syphilis, they no longer respond to the screening tests according to this group. For instance, they talk about all the AIDS in Africa and no syphilis. That does not seem to be reasonable. They should be going together. So then, in this age when we have superbugs and already resistance, total resistance to gonorrhea, for instance, in a certain group of people, the antibiotics are working less and less. When it comes time when antibiotics are no longer working for these infectious diseases, what does a homeopath have to offer? So the first point is it's illegal and unethical to treat syphilis with only homeopathy, at least in the first world countries. Other countries where there are no resources, there are homeopaths trying to treat these types of diseases. But then it is a serious disease. This is not a light infection. This is a part of the picture, not trying to be too graphic, of how serious syphilis can do. Not only does it eat through the surface of the body, but it eats through the aorta, it eats through the heart, it eats through the brain. It's quite destructive and can cause death if the antibiotics are no longer working. So then we have this quote that is word, oops, excuse me. We have a quote here that says, or answers the question, or tries to, whether or not that we have one remedy for syphilis. This is an answer to some homeopaths who've attempted to read the Organon and Hahnemann's book on the nature of natural diseases. So he says in one paragraph in the Organon that mercury remedies, homeopathic, could completely cure the venereal disease, including chancre, if it has not been expressed by external remedies, and is no longer visible. So does that mean that Hahnemann believes in a specific medicine for a specific disease? So we have to be careful and look at all of the Organon in its context. Here's another paragraph that says, do not treat with a standard treatment based on standard names. Instead, we individualize. We look at the entire complexity of the signs of the individual state of each patient's suffering and decide on the individuality of the patient, not the common name given to the disease. So how do we reconcile these two paragraphs? Well, let's look further into it. For instance, this is Kent's Repertory, an old edition, that shows many possible remedies for syphilis. So obviously in the history of treating syphilis, many have successfully used many remedies. There's over 100 there to possibly treat syphilis, including the mercury remedies, but all sorts of others depending on how it manifests in individual people. So when you read Hahnemann's Chronic Disease, his book called The Nature of Chronic Disease, and I have the specific pages here if you want to look it up, he's talking about syphilis in 3 different stages, 3 different clinical states. The new, brand new, simple syphilis alone, with the chancre untouched and still present, and a different clinical state where it's still a brand new, simple syphilis, the first time the patient's been sick, and the chancre is gone due to the allopathic or some other treatment. And the syphilis, the 3rd clinical state where it's complicated with sora. In this case, we can just say the term chronic illness. If there's any other chronic disease in the person and the person gets syphilis, even if the chancre is present, that's a different clinical state requiring a different clinical approach. So this begins to answer about the specifics for syphilis. If there's a first simple state of syphilis and the chancre is still present, then there's no complication, and there's no complication with sora, another chronic disease. Then there's a simple cure based on the simple clinical picture of the eruption. It's this particular state, this brand new, the patient's never been sick with any other disease in their life, and this is the first time they've ever had an syphilis. Then the mercurial remedy can cure it. By the way, here's a picture of a chancre. Some people pronounce it chancre in modern times because of the common name canker sore, C-A-N-K-E-R, which has nothing to do with syphilis. But this is the original word for the ulcerative eruption, usually in the genital area or some other wet mucus area that's been contacted by the infectious agent. All right. So then the second clinical state Hahnemann describes is if the canker's gone due to the treatment of the primary syphilis, then he says there is no certain cure. And the symptoms may work, the mercury may work to cure the symptoms only if there's no other chronic disease in the person. So, I don't know how many people you know that are 100% healthy these days. So this clinical state is also rare. And Hahnemann further says that if the canker is gone due to some other treatment or other reason, and you give the right remedy, the canker will come back, and the canker has to completely disappear with no trace of a scar, nothing left on the skin. The skin should be like nothing ever happened there. Then you can be pretty well assured that the syphilis is cured. Well, in modern times, stage 1, stage 2 are not seen in human practice. Everyone we see, when we carefully question them, has had some other disease or has a chronic disease in homeopathic terms. So therefore, we don't have the luxury of using a mercury remedy and expecting a cure in syphilis. It's impossible to cure it. The venereal disease alone, until you get rid of all the other chronic disease first. That's the implication of the word sora. One of the, remember Hahnemann described 3 miasms with 200 years ago with his European patients. And the 3 names he gave were sora, syphilis, and psychosis, S-Y-C-O-S-I-S, which is Greek for the figwort. So still we're focusing on syphilis before we get into a more general discussion. So he's saying, Hahnemann is saying, syphilis must be freed from all other chronic disease, or should say the patient needs to be freed from all other chronic disease before the syphilis can be cured. This is the modern predicament of the modern homeopath. So how do we get to that point? And this is again a summary of what Hahnemann actually said. He said, first, lifestyle changes must be made. What does that mean? That means the patient can't reinfect themselves. They have to change their life habits, or you're not going to get anywhere. Then you have to start getting rid of the other chronic diseases. You have to undo the adverse reactions as a result of the allopathic treatment, or stop the allopathic medicine. Then what's remaining, the chronic disease that's there, has to be treated correctly with homeopathy. And after the chronic disease is gone, which can take a while, it's not something quick, then the mercurial remedy might be the one to try for the syphilis. However, if it doesn't seem to do the job, then you have to give more remedies for more chronic disease. You have to be more careful to get rid of all the chronic disease. Okay. Then you can try the mercury remedy again in a different strength perhaps. And even then, when you give the right remedy for the syphilis finally, the cure is uncertain unless the canker reappears and totally disappears, as if the canker, as if there was a sore never there. No scar, no irregularities, the skin has to be perfect. Then you can be pretty sure the syphilis is gone, says Hahnemann. So what are we confronted with here? Treatment is requiring, says Hahnemann, going through those steps. We have to do at least 5 different remedies. And you have to give the right remedy at the right time, in the right order, and the right potency. You have to have the complete cooperation of the patients and their lifestyle. And to be able to do this, we need trained, experienced master homeopaths, which are not too many of in the world these days. And we need a transformed culture that has different priorities. That is, the whole culture has to work together to try to get rid of these infectious diseases. There has to be cooperation from the patient. So this is a tall order. All right. So this is what Hahnemann says about syphilis in his 200 years ago. Now let's try to generalize. The purpose here is to try to talk about what miasms may mean for modern times, not only in people but in animals. So we have to look more carefully into the language. So Hahnemann is using the word syphilis as a miasm process, not the name of a disease. First step to think about. The pathogen, when we say the word syphilis in modern times, we think of the bacteria. The pathogen is not the disease. The microbe is only one part of the disease process that includes a living person and their susceptibility, or their, how their immune system is, how strong or weak it is, and it includes the environmental variables as well. So the whole disease is not the name of the microbe, as we automatically think of in modern mainstream medicine. It's only part of the whole disease process. Further, when we use the word dynamic infection or dynamic contagion, the so-called agent, the contagious agent, bacteria, is not the disease. It's a carrier of the noxious, dynamic, sick-making influence. The bacteria is not the disease, but it's the energy, the bees, the vital force, the life force of the bacteria that we are susceptible to, not the physical thing. Right? That's all implied in the word dynamic contagion. And again, this is still ahead of modern science. It remains to be worked out by mainstream science what this dynamic influence means, as opposed to the chemical or structural influence of a bacteria. So Hahnemann does not mean that miasm is a static disease name or disease category. It's a dynamic disease change. So again, this is hard to switch thinking because we're so imbued with the mainstream modern materialistic science that we can't think dynamically very easily. So one of the clues is that it's not a miasm. If we think of it as a noun or an object or a thing or a disease or a category, then we're missing the point that Hahnemann's trying to make. So in English, we have to say it is more like to miasm. German is a dynamic language, which means that the nouns are also verbs. And English is a static language. By the context of the sentence, we know for sure whether it's a noun or a verb. For instance, if I use the word hug, we either have a hug or to hug, and we know exactly what we mean in a sentence. But in German, it doesn't matter. There are nouns and verbs at the same time. So to get the full understanding of the word miasm, we have to think of it as a verb, an action, a process, a sequence of events. So it'd be easier in an English mind to say to miasm rather than a miasm. So this, to be miasmed, to miasm, or the miasm process, then has a specific description in the book on chronic diseases by Hahnemann, here in a table form. Okay, so the first moment, the first stage, is the instantaneous contact with the contagion. Instantaneous implies here not a physical exchange or a chemical exchange or bacteria growing and multiplying in your body, but a spark of energy would be more like the metaphor here. Instantaneous transformation begins of the whole organism on contact with this dynamic contagion. Right? The whole being is starting the transformation, and during this transformation, inside and out, this is called the latent stage. The whole organism is being transformed. And this is the time in people when they say, I feel lousy, my energy changed, my emotions are changed, I can't think, I can't concentrate. They go to their doctor, they do all the lab tests, all the imagings, they find nothing, and then they send the patient to a psychiatrist. But this is the time when homeopathy does preventive medicine. The person knows that they're sick, the homeopath knows that they're undergoing change, even if it hasn't caused destruction, pathology that can be found on tests, and we can prevent the progress of chronic disease by treating people in their latent stage. You know, before Hahnemann, this was not thought of, but we take it for granted as modern homeopaths and do it all the time. And who knows what chronic diseases we're preventing when we do homeopathy correctly. Then, here, after the whole person is transformed internally and externally. Then there's a breaking out of the external ailment to the skin. There's an eruption on the skin, a skin manifestation. After the whole transformation, it also then includes the skin, or this, the body tries to throw it off to the skin, as some homeopaths might say. And this is where the names come from. Right? The skin manifestation is clinically observable, and you can make a long description of what a chancre looks like. But Hahnemann just chose a word to make a shorthand for the skin eruption manifestation. Right? He saw 3 different categories of skin manifestations, and that's where the names come from. They're not names of disease. They're just shorthand names for the skin eruption phase of this one miasm process for all the miasms. Now, if you've read the Organon, you know that there are also acute miasms. So then, for instance, smallpox or some other serious disease that comes out with a skin eruption, there's a crisis, and then either you die or then you recover. If you recover, then that is an acute disease ending. Right? In modern times, again, we don't see this so dramatically because there's so much medical intervention. But in old times, these contagious diseases were serious enough to cause death, and so this was a crisis. And if you got through it, then you were back to your usual health, then you had an acute miasm. By definition, if you never get over this process, that is, you live through the crises, but you're never well afterwards, then you have a chronic miasm. No matter how carefully you live, how good your lifestyle is, by definition, it's a chronic miasm if it will not leave your organism without the right dynamic treatment, the right homeopathic treatment. And this is what Hahnemann called the natural chronic disease. So the natural chronic disease were the chronic miasms. Chronic miasms, in short, are called dynamic contagion. They come about, the pathway to chronic disease by miasms is by a single pathway of dynamic contagion. Now, so then, the same thing will be true in animals. There can be chronic disease in animals due to improper treatment. There can be chronic disease due to feeding or treating the animal wrong in their life habits. But there's another way of getting chronic disease in living organisms, including animals. And this is the miasmatic process. It is a unity of process. No matter what names you give them, they are all the same process. So Hahnemann distinguished the miasms based on the skin eruption stage appearance. The skin eruption description is just a shortened name that he gives. And it was, in particular, we're talking about the syphilis miasm. It has a chancre stage. But they all the miasms are the same dynamic process. Okay? This is what I think is missing in other interpretations of miasms. The unity of process of chronic disease by miasm, by dynamic contagion. Right. So, specifically back to syphilis, again, we're using this as an example to distinguish the language of modern science and the use of the word syphilis and Hahnemann's use of the word syphilis. So modern germ theory says that it's a spirochete bacteria called Treponema, and it's a venereal, causes a venereal infection named syphilis. And in modern thinking, if the pathogen is killed, then the disease is cured. So, the antibiotics are supposed to eradicate the disease, but here's a quote from Lynn Margulies, that group of biologists, who says the spirochetes can be harbored in the tissues for decades. Their survival, is around, and despite they're still there in spite of antibiotics, is what modern biologists are concluding. Antibiotics are not curing syphilis, and maybe it's one of the reasons. Remember, in tertiary syphilis, it goes to the brain. Maybe that's one of the reasons why we have more dementia. these uncured syphilises. All right. So here, just to remind you about the spirochete we're talking about. This is the micrograph, a picture of spirochetes involved in syphilis. So here we have, again, trying to distinguish the language of homeopathy and allopathic. So to a homeopath, killing some bacteria, or even most of the bacteria, does not end the disease process in the whole person. So when you allopathic syphilis disease focuses on what the spirochete does. However, when Hahnemann's talking about the syphilis miasm, he's talking about the consequences for the whole being, how the whole being changes. Allopaths think of syphilis disease as an object and thing. Homeopaths, Hahnemann says, the syphilis miasm is a dynamic that appears with endless varieties of forms, and that's why we have so many remedies in Kent's repertory of how we might have to treat syphilis. Again, the language: syphilis the disease by Allopath, syphilis the miasms by Hahnemann. Syphilis the disease is a classification. Syphilis by Hahnemann is miasm is a modification of a unifying process. Allopaths, the syphilis the disease is determined by a pathogen. Syphilis, the miasm, is described as a whole dynamic contagious process. Right? You have to switch our way of thinking to dynamic thinking, not object thinking, not material thinking, not thing thinking, but dynamic thinking or life thinking. Right? This is one of the requirements that classical homeopaths kind of have to go through, and before they can really get into understanding all the consequences of homeopathy. Now, so why are pathogens, microbes, involved in disease? They're bacteria, let's say. Bacteria are a life form. They're not a disease. Bacteria have their own things to do. And this way of speaking in regular medicine that the bacteria is the disease is not the whole picture. So when they say that, for instance, if you have a sore throat and you go to your doctor and they do a culture and they find strep and they say you have strep throat. Well, some people catch it. Some people get seriously ill from it. Some people are resistant to it. Some people are carriers. The strep is only one factor. A dead person can't get the strep throat. You have to have a susceptible living person. You have to have the right environmental characteristics. And you have to have the carrier of the energy, the bacteria. But the shorthand way of saying that bacteria is the disease, it misses the point of holism and dynamic thinking. Okay, so why are these microbes involved in disease in people and animals? Well, let's look into it from the point of view of what Margulies called symbiosis. So let's go through her way of thinking, and it took her whole lifetime to convince biologists that symbiosis was one of the pathways of evolution, and still not everyone accepts it in biology. But she proved that early life forms incorporated bacteria and to become new life forms, and she called this genetic symbiosis. For instance, in plants, it is confirmed that cyanobacteria are the basis of the chloroplasts in plants. It's confirmed, it's proven that another bacteria became the mitochondria in humans. Right? They, if you look at the mitochondria, they have their own DNA. It's circular like bacterial DNA. And if you, analyze it as we can in modern times, the DNA in mitochondria does not match the DNA in the nucleus. It matches the DNA of bacteria. So it's proven that bacteria were incorporated into complex life forms and they work together. Margulies, before she passed away, was working on spirochetes. Right? as ancestors in complex living forms to all the motility organelles: sperm tails, flagella, cilia, microtubules, and axons. So there's some examples and pictures here. Flagella, look at the spiral shape of the flagella, the spiral shape of cilia, even the spiral shape of sperm tails, the spiral shape of axons of nerves. All these were to her evidence that not only the mitochondria and the chloroplast, but other bacteria became incorporated in complex life forms and worked together, symbiotic. Here, by the way, is another spirochete, the Lyme's disease. Spirochete. You know, brings to mind the controversy about chronic Lyme's. You know, it's a controversy because if they can't find the spirochete, then they can't have Lyme's disease. But again, if the syphilis spirochete can hide and not be found, I think the same thing is true with the Lyme spirochete. That people remain sick, even though most of them have been eradicated by bacteria, because they didn't eradicate the dynamic disease in its whole. They only killed a bunch of bacteria. So we have to think then, in modern times, not of the spirochete as a physical entity, but as a dynamic. The historical infection of some virus is, so some spirochetes no longer produce disease. The spirochete is now, as said Margulies, and that spirochete material is now part of the motility organelles in the body and is part of our normal healthy self. However, not all bacteria, focusing on that particular microbe, not all bacteria have come into complete coexistence with the larger organism. Therefore, the dynamic ongoing process towards symbiosis produces disease. They haven't learned to work together for mutual benefit. So in the attempt to mutually adjust to each other is what we call disease, and is what homeopaths call the chronic miasm process. Okay? So this is a different point of view. That is, bacteria aren't the enemy. Bacteria are a life form. We're a life form. We're trying to adjust to each other, and it takes time, long time. You know, maybe centuries, maybe more than centuries, for this complete symbiosis, mutual beneficial symbiosis to occur. In the meantime, then the interaction between two life forms causes disease. So to think not of the spirochete as a thing, but like a sine waves, that was what this picture is supposed to represent, you know, like waves on an oscilloscope, a dynamic, an energy, and we're susceptible to certain energies and not to others. Certain energies give us symptoms of disease, other energies we don't have any effect from. So the chronic miasm called syphilis is the human response to the still recognized as foreign spirochete dynamic. The natural chronic miasms described by Hahnemann are the results of coevolution and the progress between dynamic contagion and the host organism. It's a coevolution. The complex organism, animal or human, and the microbe are learning to coexist, and in doing so are co-evolving. But the end result should be the mutual symbiosis of a new evolved organism. Now, you know, part of the evidence about this ongoing symbiosis is to look at the DNA of the Treponema, the syphilis-causing spirochete. It's less than 1/3 the size of other wild spirochetes to grow in ponds and things. It's lost 2/3 of its genome because it is adjusting to life in a living organism. You know, you can't culture Treponema, the syphilis spirochete, in a petri dish or a test tube or on agar. It will not live except in another living organism, traditionally rabbits. Right? The reason that they used rabbits is because it has to be a living organism for the syphilis to stay alive. So this then is further evidence that there is continued coevolution, but the Treponema is 2/3 of the way towards this coevolution, perhaps. All right. So then I think this dynamic contagion process applies to animals, not just people, and it gives a framework to understanding the new way instead of the old way of germ theory. Like the old approach to infectious disease, it's running into a wall, which they call antibiotic resistance, because, you know, before you can kill all the bacteria in animals or people, you're going to kill the person first. There's so many billions, more trillions, more bacteria in the human body than there are living cells. It is a process that will not work. It will not make life forms healthier to kill another life form. It is not the right approach. Okay, that is all I wanted to say about miasms today. Any comments, or Jeff, any feedback?
I'm sure there'll be a lot of comments. I know Shelley just had an interesting comment about the disruption of microbiome versus the antibiotics used in syphilis, but perhaps Shelley would talk to us, because I'm not quite sure what she was asking. Can you hear us, Shelley?
I'm here. Can you hear me?
I do.
Yep.
Okay, cool. Yeah, this was something I learned a couple years back from one of our colleagues, Rick Palmquist, who said that when I first heard him talk about the mitochondria are derived from bacteria, and I looked it up, and it's supposedly rickettsial bacteria. And he said every time we take an antibiotic, it kills off some of our mitochondria. And his suggestion was to take coenzyme Q10 if you're going to take an antibiotic.
So
that was just a general suggestion, but it was an interesting thought.
I think then I will start recommending that to every patient, but it's not enough. You know, you have to take the probiotics, you have to do repair, and so on. And
yeah, definitely.
Yes. So, but I will add CoQ10 now to the red after antibiotics. Thank you for that.
Sure.
And Shelley, do you know, did Rick cite any reference or any particular?
Oh, this was a while ago, but I'm sure we could get a hold of it from him.
I'll ask him. Yeah.
Yeah.
Great.
Okay.
Great. Excellent. And Jane was just mentioning that, you know, this what we're talking about now, the co-evolution, is a fascinating topic, and perhaps because we're finding out that mitochondria and ATP production are essential for vitality and the maintenance of life, and I'm wondering how syphilis might play in there, and or the use of antibiotics against the syphilis.
I'm not aware of that research, but one of your attendees maybe can answer that.
I'm just trying to rephrase. Would you say that, in your opinion, the disease, or in Hahnemann's opinion, that the disease, the uncured disease of syphilis, the miasm resulting from the disease, was worse, better, or the same as the quote-unquote cured disease?
Worse than which disease?
The cured non-homeopathically. You know, they use the topical and the
right. So in two different places, one place Hahnemann says that the chronic miasms are more common, and in another place he says that allopathic treatment is more responsible for chronic disease. So then he, you know, for modern homeopaths, they're both a problem. I don't know the statistics on it. But let me say this about corticosteroids. There are some modern homeopaths who talk like this. Let's say a child or an animal has atopy or allergies and eczema. Then in human medicine, a pediatrician will say they have a good chance of developing asthma. Some homeopaths say it's the corticosteroid treatment that drives the disease away from the skin to a more vital organ, and that's why they get asthma. But Hahnemann doesn't say that. What he says is that the disease has already transformed the lungs and the skin and the immune system. If you don't allow it to express on the skin, then it will reawaken the disease in the lungs that's already there. And if it's not treated homeopathically, then the whole atopic condition, the asthma will come up. If that person doesn't have a healthy lifestyle or has unfortunate events in their life, the lung will get sick and show itself as asthma anyway. So again, we have this modern conception of suppression, which Hahnemann does not describe. Right? The miasm process means that the whole organism is already sick, and it's not just corticosteroids suppressing from the skin and driving it to a vital organ.
Any other discussions? Sue, did you want to say something?
Oh, no, I'm just sitting here making big star notes around things. And that whole idea about the disease encompassing the totality of the individual at the moment that there's contact, even though it hasn't manifested necessarily in the physical yet, or you know, in that deeper physicality. It's there, but not apparent to our discernment. It's something I think we really need to remember.
I think even in animals, you can see a change in how they eat or how they exercise, what foods they crave, how they sleep, whether they want hot or cold differently. That latent stage is not just what the patient tells us, but all their life habits, and I think you can apply it to animals as well. You don't have to wait till the lab tests are bad, even in animals.
No, that's absolutely true, and I think there's a lot of things that get called normal that are pathology. I had we see it even in goofy things like normal temperature ranges in different species, and when we treat them with remedy to which they have an appropriate curative response, we'll see that those things change. It's really fun, actually.
Very good. In infants that don't talk, or the elderly that are, maybe not as oriented anymore, we rely on the loved ones or the owners or the close ones to fill us in on telling us those habits. And, that's one of the things about homeopathy. We don't ignore those details. So, and I think it's true for many animal, owners or caretakers, that they can make just as much detailed observations as mothers do for their children.
Great. Any other comments before I ask? Joel, I'm wondering what you think about the utility, if any, of the modern miasms and why they came to be in the first place, and are they useful?
You mean other than the three that Hahnemann speaks about, Jeff?
Yeah.
So, what the modern classical homeopath sees is that everyone has all three miasms now. Therefore, the distinguishing that a person only has a syphilis miasm, or only has the psychotic miasm, or only the psoriatic miasm, and therefore helps us choose a remedy, no longer exists. So we look at a person today and the totality of their disease and make the best choice, irrespective of what category some people might want to make about miasms. And let me say this about modern homeopaths who are naming more and more miasms, 10 of them, 11 of them. You know, this is just merely a naming of disease by their pet theory. It is a big misunderstanding that miasms are names of disease. They are not. The miasm process is what's significant for modern times. It helps us to expand from the limited materialistic germ theory to a more inclusive look at disease and relating it to the interaction of different species, not as enemies, but trying to work with each other.
Well, it's Susan Beale again. Am I misunderstanding that Hahnemann said that the presence of sora in an individual is the thing that's required in order for the other attachment manifest, whatever that word that we're going to use is, of the other miasms? So if we're not going to have the not syphilis as an acute fixed miasm, but syphilis as the miasmatic sense, that we're not going to have syphilis in that way unless we have pre-existing sora. Is that accurate or no?
So, you know, the Hahnemann talks about the original disease in the introduction to the Organon and the nature of disease. In German, it's called Urübel. Where did the first disease come from? What was the first disease? And so that's a different subject, but essentially disease, the original disease, the malady, the prototypical disease, says Hahnemann, is caused by people interacting with people. And that first one was sora. But do you need sora to have different miasms, different diseases? When you read what he said about syphilis, that some people didn't have sora, and evidently Hahnemann didn't have sora, and that's why he could see it in others. You know, if you're immersed in it like a fish in water, you don't think about the water. He could see sora because he didn't have it. It doesn't mean he never got sick. So then you don't, in modern times, not in ancient times, in modern times, you can have any of the miasms without the others. But the way we live in modern times, complicated, many variables, globalization, food from all over the world, people from all over the world, we don't see people with single miasms anymore. So yes, I think Hahnemann said that sora was the first disease, but that you don't need sora to get the other miasms. All you need is other noxious influences that you're susceptible to.
But then, if you don't have sora, doesn't your body fight off the disease as syphilis? So it's gone out of your body, the miasmatic influence.
So that's right. Some people don't catch syphilis. They're exposed to it and don't catch it. So there are variables, often called the constitution, or, you know, whether you live in unsanitary conditions and you don't do hygiene, you don't have an adequate nutrition. There's all sorts of variables that Hahnemann mentions that can make you susceptible to the dynamic contagion, but not everyone is.
So my background, it looks at, and maybe it's been accurate for, and not been accurate for the last 30 years, but looking at acute fixed miasms as a diagnostic label, not even a diagnostic label, as a disease that has the same pattern in all the individuals, you know, that everybody is going to show up with this pattern of symptoms, and it's truly an acute disease in that it's either going to get better on its own or it's going to kill you, or you're going to get sort of stuck in that holding pattern of it, which is different. Be careful of the word fixed. You know, names come about because it looks like they're the same pattern. Smallpox, cholera, through the centuries of influencing humanity. But if you go into the individual manifestation in detail, there's always differences. There's always a difference, and I mean, historically we see that in diagnostic label states in humans and in I mean, I don't differentiate humans from animals, but we would see something that got labeled with a diagnostic label like parvovirus, that when it first showed up for a period of time, this is what it looked like in the individuals, and then over time it got really messy and less unique and covered more, you know, just covered more remedy states, and would have a gastrointestinal thing and then would have a cardiac thing and all of that. So it doesn't stay fixed.
That's right. We can take Hahnemann when he treated, let's see, scarlet fever in 1799. Right? Belladonna was the remedy.
Exactly so.
For almost everybody, right? All the kids that were getting it. Then he says 30 years later, belladonna didn't work, right? You know, it changed the way it manifested even in that fast in the European population. It's the same with all diseases if we look at them carefully. So in modern times, if we have those, you know, we can't say the swine flu, if you have H1N1, what we used 4 or 5 years ago when it first started has nothing to do with what remedy helps it this year.
Well, we see we see the same thing in porcine endemic diarrhea. What it looked like when it first broke is nothing like what it looks like now.
Right.
Yeah.
You know, when I was in medical school, we learned you don't treat strep, and the kids are going to get rheumatic fever. I haven't seen a case of rheumatic fever in 30 years. Instead, there was a time when kids with strep, and this was even with proper treatment with antibiotics, the kids would get kidney disease as the manifestation of strep, and that has more or less disappeared. And there's occasionally we see scarlet fever coming out on the skin. But now what do we see? Pandas, they get it in their brain. These kids suddenly become OCD, and they suddenly have other psychological changes, and they know it. The kids don't want it, and they can't get rid of it. It's not psychological. So the appearance or the secondary or after effects of strep have changed just in my career, right? From the heart to the kidneys to the skin and now to the brain. So back to acute fixed miasm. So
they're not fixed for very long.
So that's the coevolution thing. That's part of the dynamic of living organisms. They're constantly changing, transforming, adjusting. We don't have to be limited by the central dogma of evolution, but transformations take place. Evolution takes place, and this, says Hahnemann, is the reason for disease when you involve more than one life organism or species. Now, also what I just touched on, is that the original disease was not some punishment from a supernatural force or from evil spirits. What Hahnemann says is that it's people interacting with people, like physics. There has to be a reaction, action and reaction. And that reaction to the influence of people can be beneficial. You can feel better from a massage. It could be hurtful. You can get injured, or you can get infected from another person, or it could be below your threshold of recognition and you don't feel any change. But that's the origination of disease. It's not something supernatural or magical, or you don't have to invoke some outside force. This is a huge, description that I see most homeopaths ignore. They have all sorts of theories about miasms, like hypofunction and hyperfunction and dysfunction, each one of those being one of the three miasms. Or, a theory, a delusion of the mind. That one delusion is you don't see reality as it really is, and therefore you get a miasm. You think that the world is going up in flames, and that's the syphilitic miasm or something. Or you're striving for pleasure or too much, and so then you get psychotic miasm. So all these theories from psychology and symbolism and mythology are totally outside of what Hahnemann talked about in miasms. These are modern homeopaths bringing their knowledge from some other field of science and imposing it upon homeopathy. You don't need to know any of those things to know miasms. And I'll say one more thing. In the tests that the naturopaths have to take about miasm, the most common phrase modern homeopaths use is predisposition to disease. If I may mention his name, it's by Vitulcas, and it's very legitimate. However, it's not miasms, it's the consequence of miasms. So he sidestepped understanding the miasmatic process and just talks about the consequences of the miasmatic process. Once we have undergone this chronic disease pathway, then we are predisposed to catching certain diseases in a certain level of health depending on our background. So again, nothing wrong with saying predisposition to disease, but it's sidestepping the actual understanding of the miasmatic process.
So that brings us back to Sue's question about whether the individual who got syphilis, which was treated and the chancre removed, and they don't have any other primary manifestations visible, whether they, in Hahnemann's conception, are cured of the disease if they don't have sora.
That's correct. But who doesn't have sora is the modern homeopath's answer.
Oh, apparently Hahnemann. What if Hahnemann got so?
There were a few people in Hahnemann's time. You know, back in Hahnemann's time, it said that the average agrarian, patient, it was most people lived on small villages and farms and raised food or were involved in food, met 150 people in their whole lifetime in agricultural Germany. So think of how much less variables there are, how more straightforward it is to figure out where a person got sick, how they got sick, why they got sick. And they could have certainly deadly diseases that would kill them, but you could figure out what was the reason, where it came from. Nowadays, we get a patient that's in Africa one day and then goes to their cabin in Michigan the next day, and then they come to Chicago the next day, and who knows who they met and what the variables are that made them sick. It's too complicated, and that's why we say everyone has all the miasms.
So, Joel, do you use miasmatic theory or use miasms at all in your case analysis, according to asking Shelley?
No, but I do, use the nosodes. They're not well proven, but I don't use them according to miasmatic theory. If I use Meterinum, which is the remedy made from figwort disease people, I base it on this complex of symptoms, the totality of symptoms, not that they have psychotic miasm, and so on. So that, to me, is my, practical application. The idea of miasms is more important for understanding dynamic disease than it is useful to choose the everyday remedies.
So Carolyn had a really intriguing question about lifestyle and miasms and predisposition. And Carolyn, can you hear me? She's shy or doesn't want to say or can't say, but she was talking about spotty liver disease. Nope. No, you there, Carolyn?
I don't hear anyone.
Yeah. She was asking about the spotty liver disease that they're seeing as with return of the increase of chickens that are being allowed to live a more natural lifestyle, free range instead of in cages. And apparently that's a disease, a Campylobacter associated disease that doesn't manifest, according to Carolyn, in the cage hens. So I'm wondering that, Sue, can you speak to that in lieu of Carolyn?
I'm not sure exactly with her I'm not sure exactly of the totality of the question, but we certainly see a lot more birds that are pastured type poultry birds or backyard birds, which are two different things, that are not raised under that continual influence of being fed antibiotics and other medicaments. And that could influence the location of the manifestation of their disease.
Right. Same thing with people. If people don't get vaccinations, if they don't get antibiotics, the old contagious diseases will return. And since the health of the human population isn't that good, it will kill people. So it's not just a matter of principle to, you have to fit it in to the culture as it really is now and make a slow transition. So there's no reason why chickens can't, again, have the old-fashioned diseases, or maybe they're not old-fashioned, but a return of diseases you don't see in chickens that are, raised in industry.
We see that actually a lot, Joel. I say that from my background with sitting on the board of the American Pastured Poultry Producers Association, and talk to a lot of guys who are raising everything from a couple hundred to tens of thousands of birds a year on pasture, and we do see some diseases that are not commonly seen in industry, again, because of the way that we're manipulating and housing and perpetually vaccinating and those kinds of things. And so it's interesting when you look at how to manage those diseases. Well, in any food animal, for the short-term comfort and relative health of the individual, but also when we start looking at intergenerational transmission of health or disease, depending on which way you want to look at that, is looking at building the next generation who's relatively healthier and relatively healthier and relatively healthier. And it's, we do see that. Ironically, with birds, a lot of the young stock still comes from the big conventional commercial stuff, although there are more and more folks kind of doing that same sort of naturally raised not genetic selection, but lifestyle health selection with these replacement birds. It's kind of fun.
When has there never been disease? Every living body dies, deteriorates and dies. It's always been. And for the foreseeable future, it always will be. Even when you look at the old scriptures, Hindu scriptures, where lives were 10,000 years in some different age, they still all die sooner or later.
Right.
So when you talk about health, we want to have a quality of life, not necessarily how long. And each culture decides what's health and what's the quality of life. There's this backlash called healthism, where people are imposing standards of what good health has to be or should be or must be. You have to live a certain lifestyle before you're called healthy. So we have to be careful about those types of standards and what it means to be healthy. And I think the same thing, applies to animals. You have to, if you want natural animals and have a happier or less abused lifestyle, it will mean that they'll get more natural diseases. Everything constantly changes. That is the quality of life. Nothing stands still, and as practitioners, we have to adjust to whatever changes are going on. And we have to, get the feedback from our patients or our animals, whether it's healthier to be one lifestyle or another.
Well, and unfortunately, that yardstick of, health is that ultra bright smile and always grinning and not having that, being in touch with that whole sense of emotional range and those kinds of things too. So yeah, asymptomatic is not healthy necessarily. So.
Well, of course, we're all exposed to the definition of health in mainstream medicine. It's all negative. Like if you get a urinalysis, it's negative for sugar, negative for protein, negative for red blood cells, negative. That's their definition of health. Negative. It's a negative definition. We don't have a positive ruler for health. It's just the absence of factors or disease, and that's about as far as our mainstream medical system goes. And I think probably in animal system as well.
Mm. And Shelley had a great question. Shelley, can you hear me? And if so, would you ask?
Yes, and yes. So,
great. Thank you.
what I'm trying to understand then is if we look at syphilis and psychosis and SORA as infections that occurred originally at some point in people, how do we apply it to dogs or cats or horses or whatever? Do you view it as just a concept of disease, like, well, maybe it wasn't syphilis in dogs, it was distemper, you know, or something else that dogs have had for a long time? Or do you look at it as a pattern of disease, like, well, if it's a more destructive kind of disease in dogs, then it's syphilis miasm. So how do we transfer what we're learning tonight in people to animals?
So ignore the people names, ignore the names syphilis, psychosis, and SORA, and any of the others if you follow modern homeopathy. What to focus on is the unifying process, the miasmatic process by which all living organisms get sick. If you follow that process, then it has definite implications in how you treat them. If you treat it as a dynamic process, then you know that you have to use a dynamic, energetic treatment. You can't use antibiotics. You can't use antibiotics, anti-this, anti-that, antihistamines, steroids, anti-inflammatories. You can't do that if you understand the miasmatic process, even in animals. Then you know that you're never going to cure them. You're never going to make them healthy. You're never going to treat them in a way that's positive for their health if you don't follow the miasmatic process, the implications of the miasmatic process. Forget the names. You know, in animals, they have maybe a different appearance of skin eruptions. You can give them your own names. You can give them your own. But it's the unifying process that you have to keep in mind if you really are going to help them in the long run.
Okay.
So Joel, sorry, Shelley.
So again, it's just the idea of sort of that dynamic battle with whatever the virus or the bacteria or whatever is with the animal, the dog, the cat, the horse, the pig, as opposed to the actual syphilis or whatever. So that then comes back to, okay, so it sounds like what I'm getting from you is the whole idea of understanding the miasms is just to have the basic understanding of what we do in homeopathy, which is treat dynamically. That there's no utility in understanding that syphilis looks more like this, you know, syphilis miasm in a dog, because we talk about the miasms in the dogs and our patients all the time. So no utility in understanding that. And no utility in then looking at the remedies and saying, well, these symptoms are more syphilitic, these are more psychotic, et cetera, et cetera.
You can say it. I mean, in our practice, we always say, well, this is a diabetic patient, this is a patient that has hypertension. You use shorthand labels to help the communication, but they should not determine the treatment.
So you wouldn't, so using that as far as the miasms, then you wouldn't look, let's say, at a dog, because I do a lot of dogs. So you wouldn't look at it and say, well, these symptoms are more syphilitic, and this remedy that I'm looking at has symptoms that correspond that are more syphilitic. If we do that, it's just to kind of assist us, but that's all you're saying we should limit it to?
Yes, I imagine in animals you have to recognize patterns, even more so maybe than in people. And if that's a pattern that assists you in your thinking to choose the remedy, that's fine, but be careful. You know, people like say, Aurum is a syphilitic remedy, but it's not. You look at Hahnemann's original anti-soric remedies, and Aurum is there.
Aurum's right there.
So you have to be careful about using that category, that name as a category, and limiting which remedies you're considering. You can certainly think of the category. You know, if it's syphilitic, then you know regular doctors are going to say you have to kill the bacteria. You need to know those things, but it doesn't necessarily lead to the right treatment.
Right. Yeah, I agree, because I think what's interesting is I feel like I'm going back 20 some years now with the talk tonight, which is not bad because there's, some good stuff. Um, but I know that part of the confusion for a lot of us early on was, looking at which remedies were considered for each miasm, like this is a psychotic, or this is syphilitic, etc. And then you would look at another one of the early homeopaths and go, but wait, he has this one as different. And so it became very confusing. And I think the net result was most of us did not use the miasms in prescribing, as you're talking about here. But I think if you set up your own patterns to help understand what miasms can look like, and this is again getting what you didn't sound very happy about, but a more modern physiological approach just to help us categorize and understand, then the miasms, which are different than Hahnemann's thinking of them, but then using those words can be very helpful in selecting the remedies and understanding what symptoms in the remedies correspond to which miasms on a physiologic basis. And I know you don't like that.
Well, no, it is useful. If a person comes in with chest pain, it's useful to know whether, even to a homeopath, whether it's the heart, or whether they were in a car accident and bashed their chest with the steering wheel, or whether they ate 3 pizzas, and have a heart burn. So the circumstance that the patterns like that do help, because one remedy for chest pain, for the heart, we know that there are certain remedies work better for the heart, certain remedies work better for the stomach, certain remedies work better for musculoskeletal injuries. So those things you have to consider. There's all different ways of looking for the characteristic symptoms, that's Hahnemann's term, in the patient. And you never know where you're going to find them. And there's nothing wrong with tangential thinking or considering different patterns that have to do with physiology or pathology. You can try those out. You just can't limit yourself to one way. You have to individualize it according to the needs of the patient or the animal in front of you.
So Joel, the thing that seems to be missing in this conversation a little bit to me is that we're separating animals from humans and presuming that they're different. So if the original disease is people interacting with people, why do we have that tendency to think that it's any different with animals? And why do we somehow have the tendency to think in our conversations that sora in a dog is a different disease than sora in a human?
Well, and I just don't have the experience. I don't know. And Hahnemann didn't focus on animals either. But where did the original gonorrhea came from? Probably from sheep. Mm-hmm. On, it's so.
Well, and then they lived in proximation. I mean, yeah. the animals were in the homes of the humans, and the humans were in the homes of the animals. I mean, there wasn't any.
And we pick up diseases from animals. We give animals diseases. It's just the emphasis, due to my experience, that I made the differentiation. And those of you who have a lot of animal experience know that distinguishing is not so real, but it's just outside my realm of experience with using remedies. We have some homeopaths in our group who have a lot of experience, more experience with animals. One of them, homeopath, treats cats very successfully and uses the same provings, the same information that we have with humans to successfully apply it to cats. So that would be an example where animals and people aren't so different. As far as the original disease, it could have been an animal with the human was the original disease, not human with human. But we don't have that historically recorded anywhere.
And Shelley had one more of many, apparently, great questions. And Shelley, I would concur. You want to ask Joel, and maybe he will.
Sure. Joel, we have a forum, and I have a lot more questions, and I think other people probably do as well. And I was wondering if you would be willing to participate maybe just for the next week on our forum. We could give you access, because I know two of us tonight, at least, who are on the board are here, and we'll vote for it. And just so we can continue the discussion, maybe just for the next week and not bother you much further beyond that.
It's a forum sponsored by whom and for what purpose?
Oh, it's just the AVH forum. It's our listserv.
I
So,
see.
and it'd just be to ask you some more questions that we don't have time for tonight.
Oh, I'd be happy to be available for questions if it seems useful for you. That's fine with me.
That would be great. Okay,
Yeah,
we'll get you on there.
You'll be getting your questions either tonight or tomorrow.
All right. So you'll notify me on how to make a connection or when to make a connection.
Oh, yep. Nothing for you to do. We'll take care of it.
All right.
Just check your inbox.
All right. And it will be in the evenings and not during the day.
Yeah, it's whenever you have a chance to do it. So, you know, we can post a question in the morning. You could look at it at night and answer, and we'll check it the next morning.
I see. Very good.
Or you could look at it next week if you wanted.
Yeah. Excellent. Thanks.
That's all right. I plan to be here this week. No vacations.
All right. Anything else? Henrietta, Judy, anything else you want to say? I know we can't raise our hands, but nope. Then I guess we're all set. Joel, thank you. This is a fascinating subject, and we look forward to the next week of lots of questions and answers.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and thank you for all your open-mindedness. And when I talk to other homeopaths that have been around a while, they're not so ready to consider new ideas. So it was very nice for me, good experience.
All right. Thanks again. And next, because you said this at the end of the last webinar that you're going to put this together in the next couple of months. On the next one that you put together, be sure to let Tim or me know right away.
All right, I will do so.
Kathy back in 2018.
Oh, thank you, Jeff. Okay, I will do that.
All right, thank you, Joel. So thank you all for coming as well. I'm going to end the webinar, and we will see you next month.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Thank you, Joel.
Okay.